So, welcome everyone to this new spring seminar in global history and international law. It's not only my pleasure, but also an honor to welcome not only our guests, but all of you today. And so I'm for this session on the histories of capitalism and international law. So I'm Anne-Sophie Schöpfel. I'm presently a research fellow at the Weatherhead Initiative on Global History. And Daniel, if you want to present yourself.
Good afternoon, morning, or night, wherever you're joining us. My name is Daniel Quiroga, and I'm a first-year PhD at the Graduate Institute Geneva.
Yeah, so today, it's a huge honor to welcome three well-known experts in the history, in global history of capitalism and also in international law. So let me start to present Professor Beckert. And since he is co-chair of the Weatherhead Initiative on Global History at Harvard, and it's also important to highlight that this session is co-hosted by the WIC seminar, by the Weatherhead Initiative on Global History, and also by the Graduate Institute Daniel is part of. So I would like to thank those two institutions and also the three speakers. So let me start with the presentation of Sven Beckert. So Sven Beckert does not need, everyone knows Sven Beckert and his celebrated monograph, Empire of Cotton. And so he is a professor of history at Harvard, and his research focuses on the history of the United States in the 19th century, with a particular emphasis of the history of capitalism, including its economic, social, political, and transnational dimensions. As I said, his book, Empire of Cotton, is hugely known. It has been, it has won the Bancroft Award, the Philip Taft Award, the Cunning Recognition for Excellence, and it has been also awarded as a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. So he is a co-chair. So Sven Beckert is a co-chair of the program on the study of capitalism at Harvard, and as I already said, co-chair of the Weatherhead Initiative on Global History.
Now it is my turn to introduce Professor Slobodian. He is an associate professor of history at Wellesley College. His areas of research interest are modern German and transnational history with a focus on North-South relationships, political, social movements, and of course, the intellectual history of neoliberalism. He is the author of the acclaimed monograph, Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism. He's also the author of Foreign Front, Third World Politics in 60s West Germany, and he has been the editor or the co-editor of the volumes Comrades of Color, East Germany in the Cold World War, and The Nine Lives of Neoliberalism.
And finally, let me introduce Ntina Tzouvala. So Tzouvala is a senior lecturer at the Australian National University at the College of Law. So previously, she was an RSC laureate postdoctoral fellow at Melbourne Law School, and her research focuses on the political economy, history, and theory of international law. So she is especially interested in historical materialism, deconstruction, feminism, and queer legal theory. And she just published a great monograph, Capitalism and Civilization and History of International Law. And she also co-edited the volume on the extraterritoriality of law, history, and politics. And she sits in the editorial collective of the Third World Approaches to International Law Review. So basically today we have one specialist in international law, an expert in the history of neoliberalism, and one in global history. And with that, we hope to really create a great conversation on the global history and also on capitalism and international law.
Let me just talk very briefly about the ground rules about or today's conversation. What me and Sophie have planned is to have a 45 conversation or so around a couple of questions that we have prepared for three phenomenal speakers. And then we will open the floor for all the questions that you might have from the audience. I would ask you then to please mute your microphones during the initial part of our conversation. And later on, whenever you want to intervene, to please use the raise hand function, and I will be checking who wants to address the floor later on. I think this is all the housekeeping matters I wanted to address. The floor is all yours, Sophie. I'll stop the share as well.
Yeah, thank you. So let's start now with a very brief introduction of the expertise and also of the work of the different of our different guests. So I will start here with one question to Sven Beckert and also to Quinn, to Quinn and Ntina. So about how did you turn to the history of capitalism, and also, so Sven first. So I wanted to start with you, and I wanted to start with what drew you to the history of capitalism in your first book, and sort of probe how the seminar you also convened at Harvard on the history of capitalism has shaped your views on the field. So yeah, Sven, I'm very interested in your answer.
Thank you so much, Anne-Sophie, and thank you so much, Daniel, for organizing the seminar and for this very generous introduction. I don't know how long I'm supposed to talk now, because this is a subject I could easily fill all 45 minutes with, which presumably I'm not supposed to do. But just quickly, I think I started out as a social historian, and especially as a historian interested in the history of labor. But I also always had an interest in more kind of mainstream economic history, in the history of industrialization. And then I wrote a dissertation on the history of the bourgeoisie. So they were kind of several distinct interests, and I didn't really conceive of these interests to all speak to the history of capitalism, because perhaps because of my ignorance, I did not know that there was such a field. And it was really when I finished my PhD at Columbia University and then got my first postdoc at Harvard Business School, I met a historian by the name of Alfred G. Chandler there, and another one by the name of Thomas McCraw. And they were teaching a course at Harvard Business School about the coming of managerial capitalism. And it was really through that experience that it dawned on me that all my interests somehow are related to this history of capitalism. And when I was done at HBS, I moved into the Harvard History Department. And in 1996, I began to teach courses on the history of capitalism. And at that point, I think this was rather unusual in history departments, because economic history at that point had largely migrated to economics departments. So there was not much economic history left in history departments, including at Harvard itself, where David Landis, who used to be a member of the Harvard History faculty, moved to the Harvard Economics faculty. And the interest among historians gravitated at that point increasingly to cultural history. So it wasn't exactly a kind of mainstream thing, and I was a little nervous about it, but it turned out that it attracted very many students, undergraduate students, so our youngest students, and then I increasingly began to see this as a possible academic field that would allow historians to again engage big questions of economic change, something that at this point, as I mentioned, historians had not completely left behind, but had become rather marginalized in the discipline of history. And in the wake of that, I began to organize a graduate student workshop on the history of capitalism. We began to organize conferences on the history of capitalism. And then I think it was probably by the early 2000s that there was also this emerging interest in global history. And global history from the get-go had an important strand that was focused on matters of economic change. So Ken Pomeranz perhaps was the most important representative of that trend. And so it dawned on me to combine my interest in economic history and capitalism with global history. And that led me then eventually to write my book on the global history of cotton, which at first really emerged out of my expertise in American history. It was like an effort to kind of internationalize American history, but it wasn't conceived of as a truly global project. And it wasn't conceived of as a project that was to speak to the global history of capitalism as such. But as I embarked upon the research, as I embarked upon writing this book, it became clear to me that this story was truly global. So it couldn't be made sense of in an American history and transnational perspective, but it had to be really looked at from a global perspective. And as I wrote up the book, it became increasingly clear that the global history of cotton had something important to say about the history of global capitalism. The field itself, I mean, I remember when I started teaching the history of capitalism at Harvard, my senior colleagues, I was a lowly assistant professor, my senior colleagues basically told me not to do it because they said, nobody's going to show up, nobody has any interest in the history of capitalism. But the opposite was the case. And in the history profession itself, of course, then also, especially after the economic crisis of 2008, there was a greater interest again in matters of economic change because they seemed of so overwhelming importance in the world that we live in today. And many students began to write dissertations in this field at other universities as well. And it became just a very vibrant conversation across, one of the beautiful things about it was it became a very vibrant conversation that stretched across national specialization. So it brought in historians who studied all parts of the world, and it also brought in historians who looked at very many different time periods. And just in engaging with this work, I learned a lot for my own project. I had then the good fortune, and I'm going to end at this point, I had the good fortune to start teaching with a colleague of mine from the Harvard Law School, Christine Desarmes, who is a legal historian, and that's probably of relevance to this conversation here. And while I always was believed that the state is an important feature of capitalism, I think what I learned through teaching with her was to think more specifically about the law as constitutive of the various forms that global capitalism has taken in the past 500 years. And so these were really productive interchanges as well. And I think today we are at a point, this has become a very vibrant field, and it has become so vibrant that now, people are already out there accusing the field of being too fashionable and things like that. But I guess that's a good problem to have. So.
Great, thank you, Sven. So next question, yes, yeah, to Quinn. So Quinn, you seem to chart the history of capitalism from a different temporality. So one focusing on the global history of capitalism through the history and also prehistory of neoliberalism from the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the slender years after World War I. But you have also mentioned in your work the protest against the WTO in Seattle in 1999. So I was just wondering how this has played, how this played in the decision to turn to the intellectual history of capital.
Sure, yeah, happy to. I thought, just as an addendum to Sven's remarks, I was lucky enough to spend a year at the Initiative on Global History he runs here at Harvard. And I wanted to just acknowledge something I think that's really great that Sven is doing with that initiative, which is to not just make it Americans writing about global history, but to actually bring in partners from around the world. So we have, people, fellows there coming from Senegal and India and Brazil, and that actually globalizes the writing of global history in a way that actually few people try to do, and Sven's actually doing it. So I really appreciated that. Well, I guess I'll just take a bit of a cue and be biographical or autobiographical very quickly. I think that my turn to this topic came out of very much a curiosity about the present and a desire to write the history of the present. I mean, in the early 2000s when I began this work, and one of the curious things about that moment that is still this moment, I would say, is that we aren't really even sure what to describe the era that we're living in, right? I mean, Phil Murawski famously called neoliberalism the movement that dare not speak its name. And John Levy from University of Chicago was recently remarking on this, that it's crazy that people aren't even sure if they're allowed to use the word neoliberalism, even though by most people's lights, this thing has been happening for about 40 years at minimum. So I was lucky enough to be in the early 2000s at NYU when there were a bunch of other people trying to get their hands around or get their head around this topic too. Specifically in this incredible cohort of people that Timothy Mitchell gathered at this Institute for Advanced Studies that they had at NYU since defunded. Its first product was the Nation Among Nations book that Tom Bender did that I think would also easily fit into the trajectory that Sven just described. But its second product then was a project on neoliberalism, out of which the Road from Mont Pelerin book eventually came. And I actually had to sort of pinch hit for Ralph Patak, the person who was writing about Germany, because he couldn't make it for some reason. And so I sat in as the kind of the Germany guy. And it was there that I met Dieter Pleve, the editor of that volume, and by coincidence, also a very old dear friend of Sven's, who was really a pioneer in trying to use this study of intellectual networks to understand the phenomenon of neoliberalism, not as a way to substitute for all other ways of studying global capitalism, because obviously studying, the writings of a relatively finite number of people is never going to suffice to make sense of such a large world historical phenomenon, but as a way of, I think, kind of unsettling some generalizations that we have about what conservatives and the right and market advocates want, as a way to sort of expand the palette of the things we study to, as I write in my book, study the law and statecraft as much as the discipline of economics or the phenomenon of markets per se. So using this intellectual approach is less a way, I think, to sort of substitute for other ways of studying capitalism, and more as a way to complement it, to provide a kind of counterpuntal approach to what can be, a manageably large topic of study. So I would say simply that. I think I can leave it at that. That I think studying the intellectual history of neoliberalism can provide us one of many approaches to this enormous topic.
Great. So interesting to learn more about the background of your research, Quinn. And then Ntina, and then I think that you could directly jump into the conversation and explain, how you turn to the history of capitalism, and also what the history of capitalism tell us about international law. But I just wanted to pull back a moment and ask you about the experience which led also you to examine the intersection of law, capitalism, and civilization, and particularly from its margins. And I was really interested in what, if any, role the crisis in Greece, rise of Syriza, and the austerity program and forth by the EU played in shaping the urgency of your work. So if you just want to say a few words about that, because I think I was really interested in that, in knowing if it has influenced your work on the capitalism as civilization, or I would be very interesting to know more about your.
Yeah, how much time do you have? So because that's a long,
maybe in 5 minutes or
it's a long and mostly unfortunate story overall. So I mean, my personal story on how I came to all this basically is sadly perhaps a bit less intellectual than Sven's and Quinn's, which was like, I was just a card-carrying communist back at home, and then at some point I went for an LLM overseas, and I realized like I can sell my labor and read the weird stuff I'm reading and actually get paid for that, and that felt like a good deal to have. So that's basically the autobiographical aspect of it. And also the autobiographical aspect of it is that I did so the moment I had this realization was like around 2011, 2012, when going back home didn't really feel like an option, and it increasingly didn't feel like an option for different reasons subsequently. With the rise and fall of the left in Greece. So that is the the short version of the autobiographical story, and the more disciplinary version of that is that actually when I was in London and I was like, oh, you know, I want maybe to do a PhD in all these things, a very dear comrade from Greece was like, well, I have somebody, you know, I have to introduce you to, and this somebody, I think he's in the audience, is Robert Knox, who actually, you know, he gave me a sense that this was something that was perhaps slightly eccentric back in 2011, even after 2008. That was still an eccentric thing to be doing in international law, but it wasn't an impossible thing to be doing in international law. And at the time, I think what kind of had paved the way, but also left a lot of questions unanswered, was, especially after 2003, the rise of general critical approaches to international law, including third world approaches to international law, that made, you know, it had created a space in which these discussions could be held. But at the same time, much of this literature, not all of this literature, but much of it understood imperialism in international law. So in the argument that international law is imperialist all the way down, imperialism was mostly understood or heavily understood in cultural and culturalist terms. And or imperialism, and again, that's a thing Rob Knox has written about, was understood, it was heavily under-theorized. So what everybody was talking and is still talking about imperialism, but we all mean something slightly different by it, right? And in a sense, I mean, I didn't exactly at that point chose the history of capitalism. That's something I had done before, but what did bring to my own work perhaps was a degree of conceptual and analytical clarity when dealing both with capitalism, but also with imperialism, and the possibility to talk about imperialism not in the very heavily culturalist register that was happening until then. So that is roughly the biographical / intellectual story of it.
Great,
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so Daniel, you can turn out to the next question.
Perfect. I would like now to turn to questions of methodology, if anything, because I think there are many graduate students like myself who are joining us and might profit from discussing these ideas with the three of you. And something that caught, let's say, Maya and Sophie's attention is how all of your different works and your different interventions challenge in one way or another the European nation state as, let's say, the basic unit of analysis. And we were wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how do your choices of scale and scope, let's say, do work for you substantively in your histories of capitalism. And I'm asking this because I think that in some, let's say, approaches to a history of capitalism, even in the Marxist tradition, we often see a very much nation-stated approach. So the English transition to capitalism or the Dutch transition to capitalism. While on the other hand, you have all sorts of proposals which focus, for instance, the Atlantic commercial circuit, like my decolonial and post-colonial Latin American colleagues. So between those two extremes of, let's say, the East Atlantic and the national, which scope and scale have you chosen for your own works and interventions? Perhaps, Ben, would you like to go first? Oh, I think you're muted right now.
Sure, I would be happy to answer that. And of course, this is a very large question that goes, I think, straight to the heart of all the work that we are doing. And to speak for myself, I mean, most basically, I think capitalism can only be understood from a global perspective. And capitalism also produced in a very long and drawn out process the kinds of global connections that characterize the world today. I emphasize in my work very much the globality of capitalism. I emphasize very much the need to look beyond the nation state. I actually would argue that you cannot even begin to understand anything about capitalism without looking at it in a more global perspective. But seemingly contradictory to that, I also very much emphasize the importance of the state, the nation state. And indeed, I argue that capitalism can only be understood as also a co-production of the state itself. So the state is absolutely crucial to the history of capitalism. You cannot understand anything about the history of capitalism without understanding the state, but at the same time, you need to look at these things in a global perspective. And this sounds slightly contradictory, but I don't think, but I don't think it is, because among many other things that the state does, it is also an important agent in regulating the global. How the state figures into the history of capitalism, how capitalism is global, and how the state regulates the global, of course, changes tremendously in the course of the past 500 years. And that's in some ways one of the most interesting questions we are dealing with, to chart and to explain this trajectory of change.
Quinn, would you like to go next?
Sure. I guess I'll just say two short things. One about work I've done, and another thing maybe about the way that I would like to see work being done. One is about my specific approach with the globalist book, and what I was doing there in terms of scale was to try to turn the intellectual history of neoliberalism on its head a bit, because until I think recent writing, the assumption was that neoliberals sort of began with the state as laboratory and then kind of globalized and scaled up, so to speak, but only quite late with the kind of the period of structural adjustment in the 1980s and 90s and so on. Beginning with the national case and then slowly getting larger. And by looking at the intellectual history, one could see that that's quite misleading, because the primary interest of neoliberals since indeed the 1920s and 30s was to reconstruct a global economic interdependence, which they believe had existed in the 19th century and had been smashed by the First World War. So scale-wise, I think, digging into the writings of people and then seeing how those projects were carried out in places like the League of Nations, places like the International Chamber of Commerce, allowed for a troubling of this basic, I think, incorrect storyline we had. As far as work I would sort of like to see people doing, I've been reading a lot of Polanyi recently in preparation for the Polanyi conference that's being hosted virtually by Concordia next week by Carrie Polanyi-Levitt and the associated scholars. And I think, Polanyi is fascinating because he does this kind of a three-step, right? That I think it subtly informs a lot of the work that's being done, but often unreflectively. The three-step is kind of, Polanyi said, there's a fantasy of a self-regulating market. Then he says, but that's a fantasy, and in fact, we can unmask it and show how it's been legally planned and institutionally embedded and so on. But then the third step is, however, the fantasy slowly becomes real and has real effects. And I think that the problem with a lot of the global history that's approached the question of economics and capitalism, is that it kind of gets caught on the first point. So because we have this strong rhetoric of the liberation of markets and the unfettering of financial systems and so on from the 1980s on, I feel like at least young students often feel quite daunted or disempowered, or feel like there's nothing there to study, right? And how do you study the space between the nation and the world? You can study migration flows and so on, of course, but if you want to study the real sort of action, the power centers of global capitalism, there can be a feeling that, well, that must be happening somewhere in the ether. It's happening somewhere in the city of London, away from public scrutiny, away from archival sources, and so on. And I think the advantage of going to the second Polanyi to look at the ways that it's institutionally encased and embedded and planned is that one can see, as the legal historians have shown us, really, that there's actually a dense space between the nation and the world economy of laws, of institutions, all with their own ideas that are like implicit or explicit. They were framed by specific people at specific times. There was contestation about whether or not those kinds of laws should come into existence or not. So I think that my scalar sort of desire is for scholars to sort of be attentive to that intermediary space between the world economy and the nation, and not think that it's kind of beyond the scope of human comprehension, or it's somehow, too complex to possibly be studied or fathomed.
Thank you very much, Quinn. Dina, would you like to go next?
Sure. I mean, of course, by doing international law, obviously, it is difficult not to have some form of not exclusively national outlook, right? So that's one thing. But the other thing that I think is interesting and very particular to international law is that the state is both omnipresent and central, and at the same time spectacularly under-theorized, and even like under sociologicalized or whatever. Like the state is the state is the state in international law, right? There isn't much else about it. So in a sense, I would say I feel that like international law might suffer from a certain state centrism, which it does, but not because necessarily we talk about the state too much, but because of the terms in which we analyze the state, which is basically a unitary will that acts upon the world to either to eventuate some sort of like national interest or some sort of, I don't know, humanity, or whatever you think might be, if you're a realist or if you're a liberal or whatever. So I think that's an interesting bind for discipline to find itself in. And in a sense, I think talking seriously about the state in international law would not necessarily be state-centric, because it could, at least potentially, undo the reification of the state, right? So that's I think one thing that is worth taking seriously. And the second thing, of course, would be that once you take things like imperialism seriously, you start seeing the very obvious reality, which is the state, both in the global north and in the south, was forged internationally, right? It was forged in the colonial and the imperial encounter, and that international law played a very central role in that process, right? International law, it's not as if international law willed the state forward. This was much deeper material processes, right? But international law does have a state-making aspiration as much as it has, you know, an internationalizing aspiration. And if anything, I find the interesting tension in international law, or one of the interesting tensions when you start studying in international law, is basically its ambition and simultaneously its inability to deal with the fact that capitalism is both global and, as Sven said, but it also relies on states, on a multitude of states for its reproduction, right? And this creates all sorts of tensions that I think, to an extent, managing them is the very raison d'etre of international law. But I think at the same time, it is worth acknowledging that sometimes international law, of course, plays a constitutive role, but sometimes also it does a woefully bad job in managing these tensions, because these tensions come from much deeper structures than law itself, and therefore international law cannot resolve them. And I think it's interesting to hold on also to that tension and to that ambiguity, to acknowledge the constitutive role as much as acknowledging basically its powerlessness.
Thank you very much. That really anticipates the next question I wanted to ask the three of you. And it is, let's say, what is the role that you give regulation, coercion, let's say, broadly understood, in your accounts of the history of capitalism? Because something that seems interesting to me is that for a very long time, the way we told about the neoliberalism or capitalism was essentially a history of deregulation. Was simply, we took away the state and capitalism or neoliberalism appeared freely. But I think your work really challenges this, and it shows how, let's say, coercion, authority, private and public play a role in economic processes. Could you talk a little bit more about how your work, let's say, deals with this tension and this productiveness of law of the economic sphere? Would you like to start again, Sven, or somebody else would like to take the first shot?
Okay. Okay, the next round, I'm gonna not be the first one, okay? But no, look, as I said, I think the history of capitalism is a co-production of capital and the state. And in my own work, so just maybe I should just give you an example. So one of the things that is really important to my understanding of capitalism is to move our focus in the study of capitalism away from cities and away from industry and towards the countryside and towards agriculture. And the way how the countryside and agriculture and labor there gets integrated into the global capitalist economy, becomes constitutive of that global capitalist economy, is on the one hand related to the effort of capital to insert themselves into agricultural production and to derive profit from the countryside. But that process is deeply embedded within state structures and the power of the state, and that begins, most basically by the military power of the state. And Ntina mentioned imperialism. I mean, that is clearly very important to structuring the global countryside in the first couple of 100 years of the history of capitalism. But it also relates to a new contract law, to taxation regimes which force people into wage labor, to property laws which create certain kinds of private property rights that dispossess people and make them available as proletarian workers. So in that specific story, which is just one of many that we need to tell about capitalism, but the state and in general, and the law in particular, are crucial. The way how that institution inserts itself, of course, changes drastically in the course of the past 500 years. I think we need to be very careful here. I'm a little suspicious of basically taking one moment in the history of capitalism and making that to be the quintessential moment in the history of capitalism. And I want us to focus much more on how capitalism changes quite significantly, quite drastically, and in the course of the past 500 years. And one of the things in which, one of the ways in which it changes is clearly the specific role of the state, or the specific role of law in creating global capitalist relations, and, for example, also to create a particular integration of the countryside into circuits of capital accumulation.
Yeah, so I will follow up. I think that one of the general ways that one can define or describe neoliberalism, and that also goes for capitalism, I would say, is the production of the impression of freedom under conditions within which actually freedom is quite narrow. So the production of ever more subjective, the proposal is being made over and over again that kind of spaces of liberation are being opened up, when in fact the spaces for actual autonomy are growing ever more narrow. And law, I think, has an important role to play in this. And the way I think about it often is by kind of detourning a phrase of Milton Friedman's. Milton Friedman famously titled his book "Free to Choose," but I think that one can think of it as being free to choose to be bound, right? I mean, one has no option except to adhere to a certain set of legal framings of behavior that ultimately drastically narrow the space for human creation and self-expression, forms of collectivity. And I think that's something that can be studied historically, and in fact sort of needs to be studied historically. In the case of intellectual history, I think intellectual history can provide very evocative metaphors that can help us understand more clearly what is being proposed. And to give one example, Friedrich Hayek speaks about, I include this in my book, he speaks about the leaf on the branch being exposed to wind. And his normative positive idea of human agency is that one shows the flexibility that a leaf shows in a windstorm to avoid being pulled from the branch. And this is a very strange idea of freedom if one thinks about freedom as somehow uninhibited space of self-expression. Rather, I think the kind of freedom that neoliberals quite happily own up to, and that capitalism has built into it, is that the freedom we have is the freedom to respond in ways that hopefully reproduce our own survival under conditions that we have no control over, right? And so I think that, I really like the way that Dina was talking about the sort of the instrumental role that international law has played in the globalization of capitalism. And I think that it doesn't need to be seen, and she's not suggesting it can only be seen at the top level. That's also something that affects sort of interhuman relationships and intersubjective relationships. And I think that's another thing I would sort of say to those people who are embarking on projects, is to not get sort of mystified by the greatest possible scale, that it's necessary to sort of see the movement between the small scale, the scale of the countryside, and the scale of the world, or else we're not doing it right, I think.
Ntina, would you like to go next? Just
Sure,
to conclude this question.
Yes, of course. To return to your initial question about, the relationship between coercion and capitalism and neoliberalism, perhaps, I think it's interesting because I think I'm wondering in academia how many people still insist on that. I feel that might be a common distinction within the broader left, let's say, but I don't think in academia anyone still believes that neoliberalism was mainly or exclusively the rolling back of the state, right? That feels like, I feel sometimes we're violating a little bit open doors by saying this is not the case, at least not in 2021. But I do think what is interesting, and perhaps it hasn't happened, or I feel it hasn't happened in international law as much, is to follow this through in all its implications. Quinn, I think, has done a fantastic job in following one aspect of it, right? In showing how laws and institutions embedded a particular form of neoliberal global capitalism, right? One other way of doing it is to not to take too seriously the way international law organizes itself as a discipline in different fields, some of which are economic and some of which are political and some of which are soft, and it's the ladies who do it. So for example, like if we genuinely think that, like, law and coercion are constitutive of capitalism, what does that mean about the way we talk about and we write about international law on the use of force or international humanitarian law, right? What does that mean? What sort of analysis of these fields does that bring forth, right? And I feel, in a sense, that might be perhaps something that hasn't happened entirely. So, and also insights from fields like, because I feel also we're distributing projects today, so I will distribute the project that I think people should be doing. And I think there is a lot of extraordinarily interesting work happening in things like critical security studies, right? About the political economy of the war on terror. And it's interesting because it hasn't, for the most part, translated through over to international law. And as a consequence, we found ourselves having to argue the baroque arguments American State Department arguments are making in their own merits. And once you start entering this terrain, you're going to be lost and never seen again, right? So I think, in a sense, I agree entirely with the proposition, and I'm trying to think currently the consequences of this, the full range of intellectual challenges of this proposition. And I think one of those would be to bring the political economic analysis in international legal fields that we traditionally do not see like that, and also to bring the coercion analysis. So on the other hand, to bring analysis of particular forms of coercion and domination, I'm thinking currently race and racism, to bring it into fields like international investment law that have not traditionally been thought through this vernacular. So I think that could be, perhaps these two things could be interesting ways of actually crushing this distinction rather than rhetorically saying it's a bad distinction.
Okay, great, thank you, Dina. So I would just follow up with just what you said, Dina, and ask you a question about capitalism and inequality. So to your view, so how did and how does international law underpin a global system of inequality? So what would be your answer to this question, Dina?
Yeah, great, thanks. So just to begin with, I don't find the critiques of capitalism that are grounded on the inequality perhaps the most persuasive ones, right? I think I'm much more in tune with what Quinn implied before, which is a critique of capitalism based on unfreedom, right, and on domination, rather than necessarily inequality and inequality. And I think there's, you know, amazing work. I'm thinking of Marx's Inferno, that think about the Marxist tradition and the critique of capitalism within this vernacular of inequality and domination. And I think for a variety of reasons, this is a much more persuasive way to anchor critique. That doesn't mean, of course, that I disagree with the lens of inequality, right? And I think, again, I think the way critical approaches to international law have been framed, they have been tilting, consciously or not, towards emphasizing inequality between states, or emphasizing inequality between global North and global South as also slightly amorphous entities, in ways that are of course true, right? I mean, this is obviously true, right? Also, that's why it's dominating. It says something fundamentally true about the world. But I think at the same time, in so doing, it elides almost as a matter of necessity rather than contingency. It elides other forms of inequality and domination and exploitation and all these things, right? So to be able to talk about imperialism and international law and hold on to the idea that the inequalities created through this conjuncture were not mainly or even primarily inequalities between states, but they were, for example, inequalities between classes, or it was processes of racialization and subsequent, of course, inequality between races, or inequality, sexualization and inequality between genders, and so on and so forth. So I think international law, or even critical approaches within international law, have been becoming to this reality much more perhaps than 20 years ago. But I do believe that there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done.
Did you want us all to pick up on that?
Yeah, Quinn, please. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, I guess one thing that I think that historians can bring to this particular topic, the topic of inequality, is to not sort of take it as a transhistorical kind of datum or a piece of, you know, information that applies equally in the year 0 and the year 1500 as it does in the year 2021. And, you know, there's this is talking about the kind of disciplinary divide between the economic historians in the economics department and the historians of capitalism in the history department that Sven alluded to, right? I mean, nothing is more wonderful than these sort of calculations of GDP from the year 0 to the present that economic historians use without really flinching too much. And I think that most historians in the history department would at least give some pause before using that kind of data. Why? For the same reason that Piketty wrote a follow-up to his first big book, right? Because as he himself realized, but I would argue maybe did not quite have the training to fully investigate, inequality doesn't just mean something different, but it's sort of justified and explained and politicized differently at different times and at different places with different outcomes. So I really like the work of people, for example, of he's not a historian, he's a sociologist, but Dan Hirschman at Brown did a wonderful piece about how we couldn't see the 1%. We couldn't see wealth because for a long time statistics were only interested in measuring poverty. And so that's only something that sort of became statistically visible relatively recently. And I think that what I find useful for historians to do is to sort of narrate the way that inequality becomes kind of politicized and scandalized, right, over time and at certain points. How is it turned into what the Germans call a politicum, something that is present in the political discussion that then has sort of real effects in debates. So for myself, I think this is the productive interface still between kind of cultural history and history of capitalism, which is to not take things as kind of empirical givens, but to see how they take on the sort of density that ends up having effects in political conversations and in people's lives.
I very much agree with what you both have said. And obviously, inequalities and market outcomes is constitutive of capitalism. I think that's, the way how this happens changes over time, and how severe these inequalities are changes over time. But it's a basic fact and a widely acknowledged fact that this is a part of the capitalist economy. But I understood your question also to encourage us to think about kind of categorical inequalities, like along lines of gender and race, for example. And like Quinn, when it comes to these kinds of inequalities, which are obviously very much at the center of many conversations today, I also think it's important to historicize them. And it is not sufficient to basically observe that capitalism is always racist and it has always been since the beginnings, and this is kind of an unchanging feature of capitalism as such, which I think is best expressed in many historians now, not talking about capitalism at all anymore, but instead talking about racial capitalism. And I'm a little, let's say I'm a little careful about that, because I think the way how these gender and racial categories are deployed, how they develop, what impact they have on the structure of economies, changes quite drastically in the course of the past 500 years. And in some ways, we need to understand the process in which these categorical inequalities are created and how they change over time, instead of just assuming that they are kind of fundamental building blocks of a capitalist economy throughout times. But that said, it does seem to me that, against much theorizing about capitalism, that categorical inequalities, extra market hierarchies are constitutive of capitalism. Though the way how they are constitutive changes over time. I mean, we know a lot about the gender division of labor, which is, for reasons that I think I don't need to repeat here, is quite constitutive of capitalism as such, or at least historically it has been constitutive of capitalism until this point. I mean, I'm not predicting the far future, but at least until this point. And it also seems like that categorical inequalities in terms of both individuals and in terms of states have also been a prominent feature of the history of capitalism to this day. And that, I'm trying to understand that in some ways, a beloved story about capitalism, both from a Marxist as well as from a let's say Smithian perspective, is that capitalism is a great homogenizing force. The word is, either sooner or later it's going to be all the same. And I think that might be mistaken. I think capitalism might be better understood as a system of connected diversities, and that exactly the diversities are what explains the very dynamic of capitalism. And those diversities would then also include diversities of rights or claims to resources that can be built on categorical inequalities.
That's a great answer. Thanks, Sven. Ntina, Quinn, do you want to react to this good conclusion, or shall we turn to the Q&A session?
I'd be happy to open it up to people at this point.
Yeah, okay, great. So I see among the audience many specialists also in the history of capitalism and in international law. So I would just encourage everyone to just raise their hands if they have a comment or a question, just to make this discussion much more open and to increase the quality of this discussion. So I see already 2 hands. So I will start with Charlotte Epstein from Sydney, and then Mirko. So I could collect the 2 first questions or comments, or let's see how it goes. Charlotte Epstein.
Thank you for that, and thank you all for this event. The vagaries of our time mean that I can actually pop into this event from a completely different discipline, but which is actually I'm bouncing off what I heard to be a bit of an invitation from Ntina, meaning critical security studies and international relations. The weirdness of our time mean that we're in the middle of our big annual conference in international relations, and I was able to jump out of that conference and jump into this event. And the reason I'm saying this is that no later than yesterday, I was actually, mentioning the need to turn to Quinn's book in a field that studies neoliberal institutionalism and doesn't really talk about neoliberalism. So I guess I'm going to do a little bit the same to you guys. So as I said, I'm neither a historian nor an international law specialist, but I am someone who happens to think the state is important. I've just published a book on its birth, so that's how important I think it is. But I'm saying this really, perhaps the question is to Ntina, because of your sensitivity, your apt sensitivity to the connection between coercion and how did you put it, between the coercion and the law. And the reason I came today is that as a kind of a student of international relations, scholar of international relations, I'm discovering this story that you guys are telling as historians of the investment, the terrifying investment of international law by neoliberalism at the moment. I discover that story coming from the perspective that happens to think that the state and sovereignty is as I said, the production of that is what we study in international relations. And I'm wondering, I was hoping Ntina could help unpack this tension between whether sovereignty can be invested back against that, or that major tension that's happening in your discipline, right? Where you have indeed private international law becoming the sort of bigger and bigger thing on the one hand, and with a sovereignty, and whether what about that tension, which to me seems to be one of the biggest political tensions of our time. And so, yeah, as a political question, it's a bit of a low ball to throw to you, or Quinn for that matter, who also told that story in his book. Thanks.
Yeah, and then Ntina and Quinn, and Sven, if you want to answer, and then we just have another question from Mirko, and then Mirko, you can ask your question. So Ntina, if you want to ask your question, answer this question.
Yeah, I will. Thank you, Charlotte, and I'm looking forward to actually reading your book. About the international law and neoliberalism and the remaking of sovereignty, right? Is that a fair way of understanding your question? Yeah, okay. So I think it's fair to stay with the remaking bit rather than with the stripping away or disappearance or all these things that were very fashionable in the 90s, right? Sovereignty obviously still exists both as an analytical category in international law and also as, I don't know, an empirically verifiable fact, or no, perhaps not that, but like as a conceptually useful way of understanding about the world. But I think that the real shift of what has happened in international law, and I think Quinn's work is also really good. Quinn's work is really good in understanding it, is what this sovereignty can be for and for whom it can be yielded legitimately, right? And I think as much as it is almost a trite point, it is a sovereignty to make markets, right? It is whether this can be done peacefully, sure, preferably so, but it can also be done extremely violently, right? Either with authorizing war, or even with making war a place of like very explicitly a place of market making and accumulation, right? And I think that's a very freaky thing that is happening in international law, and I'm very obsessed with lately, which is the changes that have come about in the international law of use of force that basically say, and I'm editorializing very little here, I'm editorializing indeed, but very little, that they say basically a state is unwilling or unable to stop an armed attack, and therefore force can be used against it. And the way we judge this is basically how much money the state is spending on the war on terror, and how much the state is willing to sign in train and equip programs run by the US. That's what makes you an unwilling or unable, or a willing and able state, right? So I feel these transformations of sovereignty as, I don't know, hand making of market making, they have started popping up in fields that they didn't until very recently, or at least we were not noticing. And it seems to me, without defending the good old international law of the 1940s or 1950s, it does seem to me to be a qualitative change that is significant, and that it is significant in a worrisome way, right? So in a sense, the thorough economization of sovereignty, I think there is a legitimate question, which is, to what extent this will survive the rise of populism, or the rise of forms of far-right versions and authoritarian versions of capitalism. It might not. But for example, like the folks that have been saying these things I was just saying about use of force, they're back in the Biden administration. So they didn't, like, they went away for 5 years, and now they're back, and like actual names like I could mention. So it seems to me that there are hiccups, and the hiccups unfortunately are not coming from the left. The challenges are coming from much more authoritarian forms of capitalism. But I'm not ready yet to say, that these hiccups have disrupted this process of economizing sovereignty. And of course, this is a much longer conversation that perhaps we should have at a different point. But yeah, like, I think the examples could proliferate the more time we had to talk.
Maybe I can just zoom in on one part of that remark or that question around the sort of occupation or the investment of international law by economic actors in particular. And I think here especially of this wonderful article by David Kennedy about John H. Jackson, the international economic lawyer, which is in a wonderful sort of David Kennedy sardonic way, reconstructs Jackson's sort of grand visions of global economic governance. And then the final line is something like, perhaps the message of all of this is that lawyers should be simply reaching for the resumes. And it takes a minute to see what he's saying, but what he's saying is, of course, this is a lot of rhetoric, but this is also going to be just very well-paying jobs for a particular cast of legal experts. And I think that perspective is essential in all of this, right? To not be flummoxed by the rhetoric or the discussion of freedom or markets or liberation or anything, but just say, well, who is making money and who is doing the actual action here? And they're the work of people like Desilets and Garth, and the recent book by Antoine Vaucher about economic lawyers in the European Union are so illuminating, right? Because you see the people who learn the terrain between the scales of nation and the world economy or regional arrangements are, you know, they're a very specific caste of people who then, in the case of France anyway, become often the ruling class. They rotate in and out of power in the political sense as well. And there I would just push back a little bit on something Ntina said there about sort of populist right-wing forms of capitalism sort of unsettling this. I'm not sure they will. I mean, I think if we look at people, if we look at the example of the Lega, right? Often Salvini's Lega, often used as the sort of the paradigmatic sort of right-wing populist challenge inside of Europe. Will they hesitate to mobilize their own army of lawyers to sort of extract the best possible deals for their clients, and alternatively for the Italian national government? I don't think so. I think they're quite happy actually operating in that space. So I think I would suggest actually that a lot of the right-wing challenges we're seeing are actually could accommodate themselves very easily to the economization of sovereignty that we're describing. Not that it won't change the sort of inflection of it, change the grammar, but open up forces that could disrupt it. But I think that, you know, this latest example of the chameleon-like quality of 5-star and League going from angry outsiders to very happy technocratic insiders, you know, is very illustrative of the flexibility around the prerogative of sort of capitalist accumulation at the end of all of this.
Sven, do you want to? No. Okay.
I guess I can just
Yes.
jump in. Hi, thank you so much for this event. Also happy to see faces of people whose work I follow and read. I'm Mirko Đuković. I'm essentially from Montenegro, but I live in Budapest. I'm a JD candidate at Central European University. My research relies on the international law and history research, as I employ this scholarship to have a frame in which I observe regulation of biotechnology, which is quintessentially done by technocrats representing capital interests. And then I realized that much of their work harms the distributive justice principle, which is very essential in bioethics, as opposed to the Marxist and feminist view on property in body. So what came to mind was that exploring this, I realized it comes from the inequality. So I started following the work of Britton Purdy and others involved in the LPE project. And I was wondering, what is your take on some of their claims, which I also found in the work of Samuel Moyn, that capitalism is rather a legal state and not economic? They argue that in order to understand inequality, one must abandon the idea of capitalist system with certain identifiable laws and tendencies, which critical legal studies also claim that capitalism should be understood as fundamentally as a legal rather than material ordering. So how do you see this in the context of international law? Is the law tool of the capitalism still, or vice versa? As there is this perpetual tension between democracy, which should be about equality and solidarity, and the neoliberal capitalism based on inequality and competition, and thus we are contemporary, like we became this contemporary legal system that is captured by the market society. Thank you. I don't know if this had anything sense, but in my mind it was working. So, and yes, whoever wants, I actually want to hear from Tina because I just read your book. And I had so many thoughts, and I'm like, oh, damn, I need to steal this idea and this and this. But like from everyone else as well. But like I'm really geeking out of it.
Right. I thought you wouldn't want to hear more from me then. So I would say that to me, there seems that here lies one of the major fault lines between Marxian and non-Marxian political economy approaches to law and to international law, right? So Brenna Bunder, who's a fantastic Marxist property lawyer, she has this beautiful articulation in which she says, basically I'm dumping it down, but it says, Marxists think that law is necessary, but not sufficient for the construction of, let's say, property relations, right? That property is, a very complicated articulations of law, of practices of appropriation on the ground, of practices of managerial control, of practices of whatever that separate, let's say, some people from the means of production, or they preclude access to land in the case of Brenner, right? And I think this would be, in a sense, a major fault line between perhaps two parallel streams of, let's say, left-wing law and political economy and Marxist versions of law and political economy. And in international law in particular, I think there has been a very well-intentioned desire to push back against a liberal defense of international law that says, oh, international law wants good things about the world, but bad politics gets in the way. And critical international lawyers have said, oh, no, the bad things are actually very heavily constituted by international law and international institutions. And this is absolutely true, right? And it's both true, and it has been for a long time very politically useful. I think taken to extremes, it can end up meaning that things happen in the world because international law wills them. And to me, that sounds like a very eccentric thing to believe. Also because this requires assuming that or somebody knows what international law means and fully controls its meaning, and it transcribes it fully into material and social consequences. And to me, that sounds highly implausible. It sounds to me like the sort of eccentric thing only an international lawyer would think is true, first. And secondly, to say that law creates property. Of course, it's true. But at the same time, I think the question is which law creates property, right? Because one could say, sure, if you're a lawyer in Harvard Law School, it does look to you like US law controls everything, right? Law, of course, creates property if you're looking from Harvard Law School. If you're looking from rural Sierra Leone, state law does not create fully property. State law is one amongst a number of normative and legal systems that create property. And that was a very standard observation of Marxist feminists in the law and development states, like scene in the 70s, which was post-colonial states were often trying to bring about progressive social change by changing laws. But what they were missing out was, for example, in rural areas of the global south, women's access to property was not in fact regulated by state law. And that's still pretty much the case. So I think to say law creates property, law creates the legal understanding of property, but law doesn't, in my opinion, first create property fully, because that would necessitate a stable understanding of the law, but it would also require a stable understanding of where the law is. And I think it's not as clear as law is whatever the US Supreme Court thing is the law, or that might be the case in the US, but it's definitely less so the case, perhaps in the majority, concerning vast numbers of people in the global south.
I mean, I could just say one thing on this too, which is that I think it takes me back to the first step of the Polanyian argument, right? That the market is self-regulating and it's automatic, it's mechanistic. That can also often make it seem like it's not worth studying. And then I think the response is kind of the LPE one you're describing, which is that let's just look at encasement, let's just look at the laws, let's look at the state, because the market is opaque. But one term that I find to be quite useful that I feel like I learned too late is the idea of private ordering, right? There are forms of creating order, creating self-governing institutions and norms and conventions that don't happen through public institutions. They don't happen through the state. They don't happen through law per se or black letter law by any means. And then you can actually enter some of the world that Ntina, I think, is suggesting there, which I think is essential, which would normally be hived off to the discipline of, say, anthropology, right? Just like norms and conventions, forms of barter and exchange that might not be monetized, or might be, at least all I would agree, one would need to understand that to understand something like property, or you know, not to mention sort of forms of inheritance and the way that wealth sort of operates. Those are all things that exist beyond the law and the state as well as within them. And I think that, for me anyway, I found this idea that order exists in both, and processes of ordering happen in both, is a way that can sort of bring them both into the same frame and not sort of mystify excessively what happens in the space of the market, or the hidden abode of production in the Marxian sense.
Great. Sven, do you want to add any element of answers?
No, I don't think I have much to add. So.
Okay, great. Daniel, do anyone from the audience have any other questions? Otherwise, I know that Daniel had already a question, a last question, and also a remark. Yeah, I do not see any hands. So Daniel, I will turn, for your last questions, a short question to which everyone could answer, and also your remark. Yeah.
Perfect. This is a very self-serving question because I want to ask something about my own interest, but I wanted to ask how the three of you in your work engage with the material broadly understood. I think there's a turning point right now in global history. Recently, Professor Armitage, who would also be joining us for a seminar, started his lecture on treaties, talking about the importance of going beyond the discursive in the study of treaties. And I think all of your works really engage very strongly with the material. Of course, Ntina as a historical materialist, but also Quinn in his analysis of the Ringstrasse or the walls of the St. William Rampart here in Geneva, and Sven, of course, by placing cotton at the center. Well, you tell us a lot about global ordering that we perhaps would not know if we only stayed at the level of the discursive. So I wanted to ask the three of you how to engage with materiality broadly understood in your work, and what do you think, let's say, this shows for the future of the field? Anybody would like to go first?
Yeah, okay, that's easy. I mean, my work is very much about the material, as you just mentioned. My last book was on a commodity, the global history of cotton, and now my writing on capitalism more broadly is very much on on stuff, on things being produced, on the mobilization of labor, on the building of infrastructures, on the technical innovation. In that way, it's probably rather old-fashioned, or as I just learned, it's fashionable again. So it's I never left the materialism behind, so I didn't have to rediscover it. So that is, to me, it's self-evident to me that this is really crucial to the understanding of capitalism. I'm trying more, for me, more the problem is to learn how to think about the realm of economic ideas in the global history of capitalism. And I think actually Quinn's work, for me, is a great example of how this can be done, because Quinn does leave the pure realm of the ideas sometimes behind, and inserts it into the more material analysis of the motions of global capitalism. And I think that can serve as a good example how to do that. And the question is, of course, do these ideas, do they just serve as a kind of analysis of the material movement, or do they channel them in some ways? And I take Quinn to argue that they very much channel them as well. And I'm trying to understand, in the broad history of capitalism, of the past 500 years, how we best make sense of that connection between the ideas about the economy and the material moves of the stuff that makes up the economy.
Go ahead, Tina.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say is, I think, maybe to end this the way we started it, which is to talk a bit about presentism, which I'm a complete and unabashed adherent of. I mean, which is not to say that one shouldn't historicize and so on, as I've already signaled as well, but I think we're about to enter a kind of a disorienting moment in terms of political economic rhetoric, because I think what we're going to see is that the pieties around which I built my book, for example, about the naturalization of global capitalism, the way that states have no choice but to adapt and sort of move according to the forces of the market that exist out there beyond the reach of politicians. I mean, the rhetoric is changing right now. It's currently changing. There's someone who ran the project called Beyond Neoliberalism sitting on both the National Economic and the National Security Councils right now, right? So just at least the way we talk about the economy is going to be changing in the United States. Whether or not that will change people's material lives is now the question, right? So I think it made sense kind of politically and as academically to take seriously the rhetoric, unpack it, unbundle it the way that, that I and many others have tried to do. But now, because the rhetoric is going to be self-justificatory and kind of and sort of covering up arguably material processes even more blatantly than before, that I think it is going to be necessary to go back to the sort of the spaces of the less powerful to find out how and if life actually is changing, even as the rhetoric changes, right? Because there's going to be, at the minimum, a huge lag from the change of elite policy consensus to the everyday life of people who are poor in this country, and people of color and people who live far from centers of power. Their lives are still going to be governed by things that we would call neoliberal capitalist logics for some time to come, even if the talk is all about green, caring economy in Davos and Brussels and Geneva and DC. So I think that there's going to be this what Louis Wacan calls the centaur state, a certain kind of humanity at the top, and then the hooves of the horse at the bottom is, I think, might be even more stark in this era of kind of, greenwashing and sort of hypocritical post-neoliberal political economy. So I think our task will change kind of as critical scholars, and it's good not to be taken up too much by the change of mood at the top.
But the Quinn, I think that's terrific, and I totally agree with you that we seem to be leaving the moment behind that you charted so beautifully. And of course, as you also mentioned, one of the core characteristics of this moment was to naturalize this particular set of economic arrangements, which in itself is probably not that unusual, because that always tends to happen. But still, there was something particularly aggressive about this. And I'm just wondering, Quinn, because you write about the history of ideas, do you think we played any role in that? I mean, our work, has that made a difference? I mean, so much of our work has been about denaturalizing capitalism. I think that we have all of that in common. We have that in common. You think our work made a difference in the...
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think that this is sort of what I was saying about politicizing and scandalizing things, right? Because I think Vanessa Ogle at least was on this call at some point. I'm thinking about her work around tax havens and the way that, for example, the tax evader has become one of the villains of this new economic turn, right? I think owes something to the way that critical scholarship and documentary filmmakers and alert journalists have sort of made despicable certain forms of doing capitalism. And as this always works, the deviants, of course, serve to excuse the rest of it, right? So if only we can expel these, these hypermobile Caribbean-dwelling tax refugees from the economic body politic, then everything will return to health. But of course, that's itself a form of shadow play and itself a kind of a trick. So one should be pulled into it. But yeah, no, I think the crossover between academic world, the policy world that's now finding its footprint inside of the Biden administration, with people migrating from places like the Roosevelt Institute and stuff into Center for American Progress, into decision-making positions, at least in this short term, this first 100 days kind of fantasy world of a presidency, is having some kind of tangible effect. But Ntina, I want to give you a chance before we.
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing is, like, there's this folks, and then there's like folks from Uber, right? And I'm not saying, I mean, in a sense, it does like buttress your point about possibly even a certain pluralism. I imagine that's an improvement in comparison to 5-10 years ago, right? That like it's now both the Roosevelt Institute people and Uber executives. And the other thing is, just to check on the thing about the disjunction between the rhetoric and the material conditions, I think that's one of the places in which, you know, the international can be really instructive, right? Like the IMF chest beats every 5 years, and then it does the same thing. Oh my God, the IMF got the multiplier wrong in Greece. And what did it learn from that? Nothing. What did it do next time? Exactly the same thing, right? So in a sense, this sort of disjunction, I think, both in the international space and especially facing the South, has been the order of the day for an extraordinarily a long time. And I think there is stuff to be learned there. Like the IFIs like repent every like 7 to 10 years roughly, and then do the same. But to go back to Daniel very quickly, to go back to Daniel's question about the material and materiality broadly construed, I think perhaps the possible disagreement would be in the broadly construed, because I think in different materialist tradition, materiality is understood very differently, right? And it's understood competingly so, in a sense that like in the historical materialist condition, this is neither property nor a commodity. This is nothing. The conditions in which we exist make it a commodity. This is nothing. And actually, you know, it's a typical Marxist argument that says it is an effect of the particular modalities of capitalism that makes us think our relationships with things, whereas it's relationships with other humans, right? So materiality in this context doesn't mean stuff. Materiality means social relations that take almost deceptively the form of stuff. Like that's what we call commodity fetishism, right? And like there is a word in the historical materialist tradition for that. And I think in law, that's quite important, the distinction, because I think it leads to very different modes of doing legal work, right? Because to do materialist legal work in law doesn't mean you shouldn't acknowledge that law is text. It seems to me that in Western traditions, this is self-evidently true, that law is text. It doesn't mean let's look at buildings, even though it might be very instructive to look at buildings for some purposes. It means let's look at social relations. That's what it means. And let's look at the social relations that make texts intelligible, or that make texts the justification of like mass immiseration and killing. And I think that's, I think that is a distinction that is, I think, quite important. I think generally, but I think in law in particular, because I think the historical materialist tradition, unlike the new materialist tradition, does not necessitate the decentering of textuality in law. It might do it, but it does not necessitate it.
Great, thank you for your answers. So let me now conclude this session, this wonderful first discussion. So I would like first to thank Ntina, Quinn, and Sven for participating in this seminar, and also Daniel for helping me to launch a second spring in global history and international law. I think this conversation has been, to me, has been very interesting, and I also would like to thank you, and because you provide Ntina, Quinn, and Sven not only a good example of what is a scholar. I'm always impressed by all the work of Ntina, Quinn, and also Sven. So Ntina, you publish so much. I don't know. I seen on inequalities, on gender studies, on I saw an article you published last October on Africa also. And Quinn, Quinn, you are everywhere. I mean, not only about the peer reviews. I mean, you peer review so many works, and also your work on the neoliberalism is really impressive and give us a lot of thought. And then also about Sven. I mean, Sven, I have the chance to be now at to see what you are doing, and it's quite impressive. And I also wanted to mention the project you had just started about commodity frontiers, which is also very interesting, and you can find more information on the internet. So I really would like to thank the three of you, not only for participating today, but also to be engaged in public sphere, because I think it's where the scholars should be today, and it's great. You provide really great examples. Then I would like to thank also all the people who participated. So this session will be turned into a podcast, and which it will be available, I think, by the end of the week. And I will also take the chance to announce the next seminar. It will be on the histories of the laws of war on April 28, again at the same hour, very early in the United States at 8 a.m., at 2 in Geneva and Paris and Freiburg, and then at 10 p.m. in Canberra, Sydney, Melbourne. And it will be with Boyd van Dijk, Doreen Lustig, and also Giovanni Mantilla. So it it will be a very exciting session. And let me also announce, if you are a graduate student, there will be a call for papers for graduate conference in May, with a keynote by Charlie Mayer. So he just accepted it. So I will send the call for papers to the audience, to all the participants today, and all the people who registered, and also I will put it on social media. So thank you so much for your participation today. Thank you, Quinn, Sven, and Ntina for participating. Thank you, Charlotte, Mirko, for your questions, and thank you, Daniel, for your help. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
Bye.